I was motivated to start working on this book right around the election of Donald Trump. And we began to hear a level of hostility towards the press that I did not remember in my lifetime. So I was really wondering how much of this was truly unprecedented in American history and how much maybe did have some precedence.
Hello, I'm your host, Steve Ordower, and welcome to Rhythm of Life. Today on the show, I welcome a dear friend and colleague, Jon Marshall, who has written a vital and timely book titled Clash: Presidents and the Press in Times of Crisis. This work explores the political, economic, social, and technological forces that have shaped the relationship between U.S. presidents and the press during pivotal moments in the country's history, and helps us understand how we arrived at our current troubled state of affairs. Jon Marshall is a very accomplished journalist, author, and teacher. He has written for a wide array of notable publications, including The Atlantic, Washington Post, and the New York Times. He also teaches media history and reporting courses with a focus on social justice issues at Northwestern University's Medill School of Journalism, and has also served as the director of the school's graduate journalism program. He is well-versed in this arena, and I'm delighted to speak with him about his latest work. Jon, I love your book. It's a pleasure to see you. And I just want to say, before we get into your wonderful book that's so timely and important to discuss, I really enjoyed teaching with you. It was wonderful. It was a wonderful experience.
I always loved working with you, Steve.
Oh, thank you.
And it was always fun to be together in the classroom. And thank you very much for the kind words about the book. And it's a pleasure for me to be on your podcast.
Oh, thank you. Well, you know, when I heard about your book and then I read the introduction, of course I dove right in, and it's like your introduction to your book reminded me of this surreal slide to this kind of dystopian environment that is creeping into our reality. And I was just curious. I would imagine you would share some of that to some degree. And that was probably a motivating factor to write the book. What was the real motivating factor, and how long did it take to formulate the idea for this book?
Great question. I was motivated to start working on this book right around the election of Donald Trump in 2016, and as he began his first term in 2017. Mm-hmm. And we began to hear a level of hostility towards the press that I did not remember in my lifetime, and efforts to try to control and intimidate journalists that I had never seen or observed before. Although I'd seen elements of it before, never quite to this degree. So I was really wondering how much of this was truly unprecedented in American history, and how much maybe did have some precedence. And as a media historian, I knew some of the pieces of this and had read a little bit about previous presidents in the press, but had never really taken a deep dive into it. So I wanted to go all the way back to the beginning, to the first presidents, to see what we could figure out were the forces that led us to this point where the relationship between the president and the press was so tortured and tumultuous. Figure out what those forces were, and perhaps look at ways that we might try to find a better path in terms of what the relationship is between journalists and the president.
And you know, as you were speaking, what really just struck me, and what really struck me about Trump's presidency, is the normalization of insanity, almost, for lack of a better phrase. I mean, that was most disturbing, when so much was coming at us so quickly right when he got elected. And, you know, I kind of figured it would be pretty bad.
Yeah,
but I didn't realize it would be that bad. But then it became, you couldn't distinguish between what was true or what was not, and people couldn't get their grounding. You know what I'm saying? It was like people got thrown off their bearings.
Yeah, no, I think we have normalized a lot of behavior that would have been unthinkable even 15, 20 years ago. I would question, you called it insanity, and I understand why it feels that way. Yes. I'm not sure. I think it was a very deliberate strategy on the part of Trump and his administration to belittle journalists, to intimidate journalists, to build distrust in the media, so that he could get away with telling people that he was the one who knew the truth, he was the one who spoke the truth, and they should disbelieve anything that they're hearing from the press about him. That was a very deliberate strategy on his part. He even said that was his strategy when he had an interview, I think it was with Leslie Stahl, late in 2016, where she asked him why he was so difficult with reporters and why the hostility. And he said outright, I want to discredit you. I want to discredit you so that what I say goes unchallenged.
Yeah, well, I guess I should say orchestrated insanity.
Okay.
Planned insanity. So, yeah, and, it's interesting how he kind of shows his cards sometimes, like you were just saying. I'm specifically doing this to discredit you. And it's so obvious to somebody kind of from the outside looking in. But what was really striking about your book is that there are plenty of examples of these hostile relationships throughout history. I mean, for instance, I love your introduction. It says, since the nation's early years, presidents have frequently tried to attack, restrict, manipulate, and demonize the press in order to strengthen their own power. Obviously, Trump's at the top of that list, at least from our experience. But, what are some of the other examples that you'd like to share with our audience before they read the book that might be, I mean, it was really interesting, but kind of surprising. I didn't know to what degree this hostility persisted from one administration to another.
Sure. There are, unfortunately, plenty of examples of that kind of hostility towards the press and animosity and outright suppression of the press. And I would say probably the three that would come most to mind who I highlight in the book, starting with John Adams, our second president, who was it was a very partisan time. We think we're partisan now, living in a highly partisan era. It was just as partisan then, if not more so. There was very little middle ground in politics between the Federalist Party that Adams, of course, was part of, and the emerging opposition. They called themselves then the Democratic Republican Party, led by Jefferson and Madison, and later kind of morphed into the Democratic Party in the 1800s. And they were vicious towards one another. And the newspapers and pamphlets that Jefferson and Madison controlled and influenced were deeply nasty towards John Adams on a personal level, as well as criticizing his policies. And there wasn't yet a foundation of understanding of sort of what a free press meant in the country. And the Federalists who controlled Congress passed the Sedition Act, which Adams signed. And which
could you just explain what that is exactly?
I will. The Sedition Act basically made it illegal to say or write anything that was critical of the government or critical of the president. So talk about something that really went counter to the First Amendment.
I know. I mean,
it's hard to imagine any law that could have been more draconian in that way. But the Federalists controlled government. They controlled Congress. They controlled presidency at that time, and they almost completely controlled the courts as well. And they went after their Democratic Republican opponents with vehemence. The most, I think, absurd example, this wasn't an example of the press, but an example of free speech. There was a Revolutionary War veteran who was a tugboat captain in New Jersey, I think along the Hudson River. And Adams came through, and there was some big kind of festival to honor the president, and they're shooting cannonballs up in the air, and this poor man, Luther, I think his name was Luther Baldwin, was a little bit drunk. He was hanging out at a tavern, and he said, I hope one of those cannonballs hits him in the arse. I'm sorry, I hope it's okay to say arse on your podcast. I hope it hits him in the arse. And the tavern keeper, who was a Federalist, thought that was terrible that he had uttered something like that against the president.
Sure.
And old Luther Baldwin was tossed in jail for saying that.
Right.
So that was kind of an extreme example. But even in the newspapers, and this is actually an example of a magazine, there was a congressman named Matthew Lyon, who was aligned with Jefferson and Madison, very critical of Adams. And he wrote some things in his magazine. He was from Vermont, saying that Adams was full of too much pomp and was a fool. And he was arrested, and after about a trial that lasted a few hours, they didn't even give him time to really hire an attorney, tossed him in jail. So this is a congressman, this is a magazine editor who dared to write something critical of the president and was thrown in jail. This happened dozens of times with other newspapers that were critical of Adams. But in the end, it really backfired against Adams because they were so heavy-handed about it and so obviously unfair about it that the opposition began to get more and more sympathy. And as many newspapers that were forced to shut down as a result of the Sedition Act, more of them popped up that were critical of Adams. And it's believed that the heavy-handed Sedition Act was one reason Adams lost the presidency in 1800 to Thomas Jefferson, who then let the Sedition Act lapse once he was president. So that would be my first example of a president whose heavy-handed suppression of the press was really, I don't know if it was consciously a role model for Trump, but certainly was existed as a precedent in U.S. history.
Well, it's interesting how one of the main points that you make in the book is that presidents who foster a decent relationship with the press, have a better go of it, basically, in terms of being able to, have their policy initiatives manifest and actually take shape on the political landscape. Could you speak a little bit to that?
Sure. So the presidents who had a really good relationship with the press, I would include George Washington did, but he was never really challenged that much because he was such a high figure, such a hero of the Revolution, and
of course,
some people thought he should just be king. He didn't get that much criticism, and then poor John Adams did. The ones who had a good relationship with the press would include Abraham Lincoln, Teddy Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt. I would include Ronald Reagan in that, John Kennedy. And when historians rank the greatest presidents, those ones are usually, in the top 10 or possibly top 20 presidents. And in some ways it makes sense. They say the journalists write the first rough draft of history, and that rough draft often sort of influences the final draft of history that historians write.
I love that. When I read that, journalists often write the first rough draft of his. I mean, it's true because they're documenting what's actually happening. And when somebody such as yourself, an historian and a journalist, goes back and tries to piece together a story from the past, they're generally looking at newspaper articles.
Often, right. Newspaper magazine articles or, in later years, broadcast transcripts and so forth. So some of the ones who had a bad relationship with the press would include, Richard Nixon is an obvious one, who's usually not fondly remembered by historians. Donald Trump falls in that camp. George W. Bush, a little bit more mixed than Nixon and Trump. In some ways, he had some good rapport with some individual reporters, but on the whole, a pretty contentious relationship with the Washington press corps. He's generally not ranking too high so far in the history polls either. So I think a president who's going to be highly effective needs to find some way to have at least a good working relationship with the reporters who are covering him.
It's interesting that, you obviously Lincoln is lauded and viewed as this amazing politician that brought the country together during a very tumultuous time, obviously, with slavery, etc. But even in your book, you write, there was another significant and more troubling aspect of Lincoln's relationship with the press, the curtailment of First Amendment rights. He shut down newspapers, confiscated printing presses, prevented some newspapers from being, etc. I mean, even the good ones are still have a track record of quite a bit of malfeasance in this arena. Could you just speak a little bit to what Lincoln was doing at the time?
So, obviously this is during the Civil War, when the country was literally torn apart, and we had an armed insurrection that was trying to overthrow the government.
Sounds really familiar.
Yeah. Some echoes of that recently. So, in some ways, I want to cut Lincoln some slack, because the country was literally at the precipice of falling apart. But it was primarily the Union Army, and in fact, it was also the Confederate Army as well. They were just as intent on suppressing the press as the Union Army. But Lincoln allowed the Army to banish reporters from covering the battles. They would listen on the telegraph wires, which were the hot new way of transmitting news in those days. They would listen in and they would censor stuff going through the telegraph wires, and newspapers in the North that were sympathetic towards the Confederacy were shut down at times. So in some ways we can say, well, I can't blame Lincoln. He had to do what he had to do to win the war. Yet it set a dangerous precedent. And during World War I, Woodrow Wilson, even though the U.S. itself was not under attack, he felt that in order to win the war, he had to do what he could to suppress the press. And he passed his own version of the Sedition Act, as well as an Espionage Act and another law.
Espionage, yes.
Another law called Trading with the Enemy's Act. And sort of like Adams and like Lincoln during the war, editors were tossed in jail. Newspapers were forced to shut down because they cut off the postal privileges and magazines and newspapers that count on being able to be mailed. Mail out their copies as well as receive information through the mail, which was the way to communicate in those days. Couldn't exist without their postal rights. And there was a pastor who spoke against the draft. He was tossed in jail. Someone else who said something, well, war is immoral. He was tossed in jail. So anything that even in generic terms that said war or the draft were bad were prosecuted. So it was a very heavy era of repression against the free press.
And how would you view Obama's relationship with the press in general?
So Obama's is an interesting story. And I would sort of I kind of emphasize three different threads in the Obama chapter. One, he was our first social media president. And like other presidents before him, Franklin Roosevelt with radio, JFK and Eisenhower with TV, and later Reagan with TV, Obama took advantage of a new technology to find a different way to communicate directly to the public and get around the White House press corps, who wouldn't necessarily write and broadcast exactly what he wanted to write. So presidents are always looking at ways to get around the press corps and get their message to the public. And Obama used social media very effectively to do that. And of course, Donald Trump took that to a whole different level with Twitter.
And also Obama was on Between Two Ferns, and he did some things. I mean, he's a very charismatic guy.
Right. So he took, and Bill Clinton kind of was the one who started like this, using late night television and the talk shows. Obama would go on The View. He went on Oprah Winfrey. You mentioned Two Ferns. Shows where he could really be a little bit more lighthearted, show his humor. still get his message across and not worry as much as about getting hard-hitting critical questions, which he might have to answer in a White House briefing room, but not on Between Two Ferns. Clinton did that with, he would go on, he went on MTV, he went on the Arsenio Hall show. Clinton was really the first to kind of take advantage of these late night shows.
Yeah.
Another thing about Obama was the level of vitriol he received, which may be similar to the level that John Adams was getting from the opposition, but with talk radio and cable TV, particularly Fox News, which had been unleashed starting in the 90s, actually late 80s, because Ronald Reagan did away with the fairness doctrine.
Yes, please speak to that.
So I'll talk about Obama, and then maybe we can circle back to the fairness doctrine.
Yes, please. Absolutely.
Obama was from the minute he was elected, actually before he was elected, was hit with a fusillade of just virulent, often racist criticism from right-wing media. Including the birth of the Tea Party, which was really was fueled largely by Fox and talk radio. So Obama was dealing with an extremely critical press, which is one reason he used social media for his own ends to try to reach his base as well. But another thread of the Obama story was he was not that friendly with a lot of journalists who were covering the White House. And he very much limited the interviews he did. He limited the amount of sort of spontaneous, take a few questions when he's leaving the White House kind of things, which most presidents will do, or after a photo op, they'll answer a few questions. Obama was very heavy-handed about not allowing photojournalists in to cover him because he wanted his official photographer, the official White House photographer, Pete Souza, to take the photos, and those were the photos the White House would disseminate through social media, put up on the whitehouse.gov website. While photojournalists who might take a photo of Obama, not necessarily always in glowing terms, they pretty much banished, banished is too strong a word, but very much limited their access to Obama. And then Obama dusted off the Espionage Act that had been passed under Woodrow Wilson back in 1917 or so, and his Justice Department went after whistleblowers using the Espionage Act at twice the rate of all other presidents before him combined. So it's very heavy-handed effort to intimidate people who might leak embarrassing information. And they always said, it's for national security, which sometimes maybe it is, but often it's information that just makes the government or the administration looks bad. And everything is almost routinely marked as top secret these days. It's sort of the default marking. So they say, he leaked something that was top secret. But what was top secret was really that a contract went to a firm with lots of lobbyists and cronies rather than the low-cost bidder, which was one example of what one of the Espionage Act attempts was done. So Obama really had kind of a chilly relationship with the White House press corps, and was creative in his use of social media, but didn't particularly set a good precedent in terms of being open to the press.
And he was, one of the things he put forth in his campaign was transparency. He's all about transparency, supposedly. So what's so wonderful about what you've done is it gives people a much more insightful view of what's actually gone down with different presidents.
And in fairness to Obama, they did put more information on the White House website, far more than the Bush administration before him did, or Clinton was the first to have a website, but there wasn't very much on it in those days because it was still fairly new technology. But Clinton did allow access to a lot more federal information in White House.
Clinton or Obama?
I'm sorry, Obama.
Okay.
Obama did. than beforehand. So that is one way he did reach his promise of transparency, but in other ways he certainly didn't.
And there's I love just the segments, the big points that you make in your book and your intro. The second one was technological advances have fragmented the media and enhanced president's ability to avoid the White House press corps and communicate directly to the public. You gave wonderful examples of this with Trump going to Twitter, obviously. We all know of that one. Obama using, really setting the, it's like a benchmark in terms of his ability to use social media effectively. But then we also had, other people use social media effectively to help get Trump elected, which was straight up nefarious and probably totally illegal. But anyway, we don't have any laws to regulate this new environment. I mean, before, when you and I were growing up, we had the big three broadcasting outlets and newspapers that were established, and they were somewhat the gatekeepers. And now it's a whole different ballgame. And I'm wondering how you see this moving forward. How do we deal with that?
That's a big question. So let's first roll it back to the past a little bit to try to understand how we got here, and then. Sure. If I don't answer that question, remind me and I'll answer it.
Sure,
but I think it's important to understand. So we really, as you said, you and I grew up with, there were 3 TV networks. Most cities maybe had 2 newspapers. Mm-hmm. A few big ones like Chicago, New York had more than 2 in those days. Mm-hmm. There were 3 main news magazines, Time, Newsweek, and then U.S. News and World Report. Mm-hmm. And that was really kind of it in terms of where you might get your news. Possibly there was a news radio show where you lived. Mm-hmm. Because of cable television, to start with, we now have hundreds of channels, including several who are news or at least pretending to do news. Available on cable. With
the video news releases, which look a hell of a lot like a legitimate actual story, but they're not at all. They're basically propaganda.
But people can really kind of pick and choose their cable TV channels that they want to watch and as you said, live in their own information bubble. And I think people on the right do that, people on the left do that. It's not
absolutely, and which is intimately tied in with the Fairness Doctrine, which Reagan pulled back, which is basically broadcast outlets had to show both sides of an important issue. But with the Fairness Doctrine, please correct me if I'm wrong, the Reagan administration argued that, well, we really don't need it because it's cable and it's inhibiting free speech, et cetera, et cetera.
Exactly. So the Fairness Doctrine was put in place after World War II. And the idea was that the airwaves are really owned by the public. And if you're going to be broadcasting on TV or broadcasting on radio, you should be doing so with a public service mission, which meant you should have content that was useful to a community. And if you had a political viewpoint on it, you had an obligation to offer equal time to an opposing viewpoint, whether it's an opposing candidate or if someone's arguing in favor of a particular policy, you needed to give some equal time to the other side of the policy debate. And it was enforced sort of off and on by the FCC in the early years. And there was certainly lots of highly partisan on radio, some very partisan radio shows. But starting with kind of the Johnson administration, they began to enforce it a little bit with Kennedy, began to enforce it more heavily, and there were some court cases that solidified the power of the Fairness Doctrine. So by the 70s, there really, by and large, most broadcasts, whether it was TV or radio, was giving somewhat roughly equal time to different sides of political debates. And then, as you said, Ronald Reagan and his chairman of the FCC, Mark Fowler, just were in favor of deregulation of almost every industry, including the media. And Congress had passed a law to cement the fairness doctrine in place in 1987. Reagan vetoed it.
Right.
And then Mark Fowler, the chairman, got the FCC just to do away with it altogether. Because he said TV is nothing more than, like, no different than a toaster. It's just an appliance.
What's the big deal?
Yeah. Didn't mention that appliances can shape opinions and frame the way we view the world. Maybe frame the way we eat our toast, but not the way we not the information that we need to have a functioning democracy.
Exactly.
And almost immediately after the fairness doctrine went away, a radio host based in Sacramento went national. And was syndicated by the name of Rush Limbaugh.
Oh, yes.
You may have heard of him. And he very soon was being syndicated on hundreds of radio stations, also had his own TV show, publishing books. And it's sort of interesting. It was a pivot point, not just in terms of media, but I think in politics. Before then, political parties really controlled what happened in their parties. Like, they could really kind of influence who the candidates were, who was going to get funded, what policies were going to be supported within the party. And there were debates and arguments and didn't always go one way or the other. But by and large, the parties had a lot of influence. Once talk radio and then cable was unleashed, I believe that the media is often now the arbiter of what is going on within the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. They're, what Fox says, what the leading talk radio, what Limbaugh used to say before he died, and now other people like Sean Hannity and others, Mark Levin, who are dominant on talk radio, can shape what Republican voters want to do more so than any organized political party does. And I think to a lesser degree on the left, on the Democratic side, but I think to some degree we can see that with MSNBC and Morning Joe and CNN having a real influence on sort of what direction the party takes. So I'm sorry, I'm digressing a little bit on the
please.
The technology.
Please, it's wonderful. It's wonderful. I mean, that's
so we have fragmentation now on cable. We don't just have three TV networks on having news shows. We've got a dozen or so.
And in line with that, John, I just have to say, the conglomeration and the level of ownership over a large amount of broadcast outlets by single entities is really particularly Sinclair broadcast.
Sinclair on TV, iHeart on radio is just as dominant. And then, of course, we have the internet coming of age in the 1990s, at least the World Wide Web coming of age in the 1990s, which opened the door, first to bloggers, people like Matt Drudge, who had a huge influence on the Clinton administration, hundreds and then thousands. I don't know if I think bloggers have probably reached over 1 million at one point at least. And then social media. So anybody now with a phone or a Wi-Fi connection can be their own publisher of information. So talk about fragmentation. We've got hundreds of millions of media outlets now. You and I may not think of ourselves as being media outlets, but anytime I post something on social media, I'm putting something out there.
And I mean, and what really I remember when I was one of the teachers for a methods seminar at Medill, which has a really interesting history. It comes, it started from Joseph Medill, who had I believe a relationship with McCormack.
Well, McCormack was his grandson.
From the Tribune?
Yes.
Yeah, from the Tribune. That was very
and Medill was a very
conservative.
close advisor of Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So, but I remember just when I was, one of the teachers in this teaching young people who are starting out at a top-notch journalism school at Northwestern, teaching them methods of how to do journalism, corroborating evidence, really understanding the process to try to actually tell the story in a productive way so that people can really understand what's going on in the world around them. It's absolutely critical. And now, as you're talking about bloggers and anybody with a phone can, start a YouTube channel, what have you, it's one thing. On one hand, it's good to have freedom of expression. It's good to have different viewpoints. But then, is a filter good? Is a filter bad? How's that played out? I don't know if it's played out so well for us. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think it's a mixed. Bag. And I think in a lot of ways, it's allowed great things to happen. First, the internet and social media. People. First, it connects the world in ways that have never been connected. I can very quickly now find out what's going on in Bangladesh if I want to find out. And people can share information that way. It allows journalists to easily, well, not necessarily easily, a lot more easily do global projects than ever before. Because a lot of the issues we face, climate change, terrorism, pandemics are global things, wars. They're not confined within national borders. So journalists do now cooperate through organizations like the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists on these worldwide projects that can unearth things that had never been unearthed before. And it gives voice to people. I know a lot of people in my generation like to look back on the 60s and 70s as sort of a golden age of journalism, and in some ways it was, but in some ways it wasn't, because it was very much controlled by people who looked like me, the white men of a certain generation and a certain class background, and majority people were actually shut out of that. Women and people of color, whose perspectives were rarely included. And very important stories were missed as a result of that. And not just missed. There's a lot of actually great scholarships coming out on this now, how newspapers, particularly in the South, were very active supporters of racial segregation and Jim Crow and even lynchings and racial terror. The Tulsa Massacre in 1920, right? 21. The newspapers in Tulsa were backed, that massacre.
Yeah, I mean, it gives credibility to people's horrible actions.
Right. So there's that mainstream press that people sometimes look back on as a golden age, often and in many ways was highly detrimental to people who are marginalized and vulnerable. So I look at that's why I look at the current age as a mixed bag, because now we have things like Black Twitter, Black Lives Matter that have done a tremendous job of publicizing incidents of terror by police against Black people, which was rarely, if ever, covered before.
Oh, totally.
And they've been able to get that conversation and public debate going, which would not have been possible, I think, in the 1960s or 1970s.
Yeah, it's so interesting how, with the various times and the different generations, there's new technology, there's new way to express yourself. I mean, it just reminded me as you're talking how effective FDR was, say, for instance, with radio. With the fireside chats, etc. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So I think he, of all the presidents taking advantage of new technology, he might be at the top. Radio had been around for a decade or so by the time he became president, but it was just starting to have like national networks like NBC and CBS carrying radio shows. The signal, the technology and the quality and the signals got good enough that radio could really reach well over half of the American public, which in the 20s it was much smaller. Other presidents before FDR had tried radio a little bit. Warren Harding was sort of famous, well, not famous, but he in his use of radio, maybe infamous might be the better word.
Right.
He treated radio like he was giving a big campaign rally. So he'd have the radio microphone in front of him, and at a big campaign rally, when they didn't have really good PA systems in those days, the candidate would have to shout. So Harding would just sort of like shout into the radio microphone.
Oh my God!
And the people listening didn't really particularly like it. It was not effective. And then
it wasn't intimate.
No,
like,
he did not have the touch.
Right.
Herbert Hoover was just sort of grouchy and would kind of grumble into the radio and didn't like to answer questions from reporters and would just kind of snarl back when he was asked something. So he was not particularly effective either. FDR, first of all, he'd worked, when he was at Harvard, he'd worked on the Harvard Crimson student newspaper. He had a sense of what journalists did and what they needed to do their jobs. So he could play into that and understand, okay, reporters have these deadlines. They need to have so many stories a week. I can feed them this information that's going to make them happy while still spinning the story my way. And when he was governor, he'd written both newspaper columns, and he had a sort of mini version of his fireside chats when he was governor to the people of New York. So he had some practice with radio doing it. And he had sort of this, he sounded like everyone's kind of friendly uncle who they both respect and they like. He had this air, both of sort of authority but kindly about it. He knew how to be warm with his voice and be very clear with it. So within 10 days of starting his administration, he gave his first fireside radio chat, and more than half the country listened to it.
Wow!
And it was about the banking crisis. And the humorous Will Rogers joked afterwards that Roosevelt explained the crisis so well and what he was going to do that even the bankers understood it. That's awesome. And he got he got widespread praise for how he did it. And he didn't do a lot of fireside chats. He'd average about 2 per year because he wanted to make sure to make every one of them special. But whenever there was a real tense point or crisis point or time where he really felt like he needed to persuade the public, he would use his fireside chats, and he would begin with "my friends," and like he's talking to his neighbors, and people would gather around the radio to listen. And it was a great example of using a new technology in a different way to get around the powerful publishers in the day. Most White House reporters liked the Roosevelts because they treated the reporters well and would have them over for dinner, let their kids use the White House playground, and have them over for dances and so forth. So they were very good at sort of charming the White House reporters, and they joked around with them. But a lot of the powerful publishers of the day, William Randolph Hearst, who you and your listeners may have heard of, probably the most powerful media mogul perhaps of all time, was after the first few months of Roosevelt's administration was steadfastly opposed to him. Henry Luce, the publisher of Time magazine and then later Fortune magazine and then later Life magazine, was quite conservative and didn't like the New Deal, Roosevelt's New Deal. And then you mentioned Colonel McCormick earlier of the Chicago Tribune, which was
and there's a McCormick building right
right here
at
at Northwestern University. But he was the publisher of the Tribune, most powerful newspaper in the Midwest, and he was adamantly opposed to Roosevelt and would compare Roosevelt to Hitler and compare Roosevelt to Stalin. Really extreme stuff.
That's
and then his
familiar.
paper would publish these kind of crazy stories that had very little bearing on the truth when it came to Roosevelt. So Roosevelt felt like he needed to go around these publishers who were quite dominant, and he used the fireside chats to do that.
Yeah, and Nixon was like the exact opposite. I mean, he was just ruthless and just harsh, and he I don't know if he's Oh, he seemed to be very reminiscent of what we were experiencing with Trump when I was reading your book. Just the vitriol that he had toward the press. Can you speak to that?
Yeah. Yes and no.
Okay.
Nixon, definitely had the vitriol towards the press. He hated journalists from way back. Even though he generally enjoyed, in his early years as a congressman and senator, usually got more favorable press than negative press. But his personality was such that anything critical just really stung him and dug deep inside of him. And he had sort of this paranoia and just thin-skinned. Actually, his thin-skinned was kind of reminding me a little bit of John Adams, who didn't like the criticism either. But Nixon took it kind of to a different level. But Nixon...
Yes.
Nixon publicly would say, usually, until the end, would say the right things about the importance of a free press and how much it was important to have the role that journalists played in informing the public.
Do you think, just from what you've studied and what you know of Nixon, do you think he had some semblance of actually believing that? Because Trump did not.
Trump did not, and Trump, Trump, all on the surface was almost complete hostility. But Nixon thought it was important to at least have the veneer of being friendly towards the press.
Right.
And in some ways, it worked in his first term, and I think also it was just the norm in those days to respect journalists and generally the popularity of journalists in opinion polls were much higher. So I think he felt like politically he couldn't directly be as hostile himself, although he sent his vice president Spiro Agnew out to make some very hostile speeches towards the press. And Nixon helped to write those speeches. He knew exactly what Agnew was doing. And he was delighted. He's one famous quote after Agnew gave his first speech that was calling the TV networks this unelected elite that was against the interest of the great majority of Americans. Nixon said, well, that really flicked the scab off that wound, didn't it?
Absolutely. I know
but he said that, of course, in private, whereas Trump probably would have said something like that in public.
The thing about Trump that's so crazy, or at least just was so stunning to witness, is that at least that's why I asked you about Nixon. You said at least they put up the veneer, the facade of this modicum of respect for the office and this respect for the relationship with the press to some whatever degree. But with Trump, he just said, I don't care.
Yeah, and I think in some ways Nixon laid the groundwork for that.
Right.
So while Nixon had the facade, we hear from his White House tapes that behind closed doors, talking to his talk aides, he was doing whatever he could to get even with the press and intimidate the press. So he had the FBI investigate journalists he didn't
Nixon
like.
Did.
Famous,
Nixon we're talking,
Nixon
right?
did. Nixon did. We don't know yet if Trump did, but who knows? The Nixon went after, had the FBI investigate Daniel Shore, who was with CBS News at that point, and later it was on NPR. Shore had written critical things about Nixon's education policies, broadcast critical things about his. Nixon had publicized he had this great new education initiative. Shore reported Nixon gave a speech about it, but there was actually nothing going on with this initiative. It wasn't real, and that infuriated Nixon. So he had the FBI try to investigate Shore, try to find dirt on him. He gave an order to the FBI to see if they could find out if any journalists were homosexuals, so they could try to blackmail them. Because, of course, in that era, that could be a career ender for someone to be. So wait,
who was running? Who was running the FBI at that time?
J. Edgar Hoover.
Yeah, wasn't he a cross-dresser?
Yeah, but they didn't know that at the time. Perhaps Nixon knew
Interesting.
They used the IRS to go after journalists they didn't like. Mary McGrory, who was a top syndicated columnist, liberal columnist.
Right.
Nixon despised her.
Wow.
She got audited like several years in a row because she gave a lot of money to this home for orphaned girls, Mary McGrory, so they kept auditing whether this was a legitimate donation.
Oh my gosh.
Or not. Robert Greene of Newsday, who was an investigative reporter who had written something critical about Nixon's friend Bebe Rebozo. They had the IRS audit him.
Oh, that's
so this all shows up in his, Nixon's. That was one of the articles of impeachment was abuse of power, and the IRS doing this was an abuse of power. When the Washington Post was investigating Watergate, he tried to get the FCC to not allow Washington Post TV stations. The Post-owned TV stations around the country was actually the main way the Post made money. He had people challenge the Post trying to renew their TV licenses, which would have probably sunk the Post financially.
See, Nixon was a cunning dude.
So he was cunning,
very smart.
but it was below most of it, below the surface.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
His chief of staff, H.R. Haldeman, came from the advertising industry.
That's dangerous.
And he understood that it was important to package Nixon in a way that was palatable to the consuming voting public. So in the early years, Nixon actually was on TV a lot. He wasn't a natural on TV, but he worked at it and wasn't too bad compared to some of the other politicians of the day. But when the going got tough and he began to sweat, things didn't go as well.
Especially in that debate against Kennedy. I mean, you got John F. Kennedy. And I always, every time you see who's ever running the FBI at the time says, we serve at the pleasure of the president. It's like, we're just like, this is a facade of a democracy. The Justice Department should not be serving at the pleasure of the president. The Justice Department should be serving at the pleasure of the people of the United States. And so there are these little things in the construct of our country that allow for this control from people in power. And I always note that when people say that, and it always just, quite frankly, pisses me off. But what are we going to do? But
so one more point, if I can, about Nixon, which I think is really important, and I think how he laid the groundwork for Trump. He and his chief of staff, H.R. Haldeman, actually wrote a memo on this. It's in the Nixon papers, saying early on in Nixon's presidency that we should cast the press as an enemy of the people.
Oh my gosh! Really?
Not just that we don't like the press personally, but we're going to publicly make the press an enemy that people should hate, like they hate crime, like they hate drugs.
This was an internal memo?
Union. This was an internal memo. It wasn't made public at the time.
Right.
And it's one reason they sent Agnew out to make these speeches. But they began to successfully, first of all, they were the first to start using the term the media instead of journalist or the press. The media sounds like this big, distant, ominous institution. So they began to criticize the media, not reporters, the media, and began to say, the media is against the interest of the hardworking, everyday, real Americans, the silent majority. Nixon called them, and I think Trump started to borrow that term as well. And so Nixon really helped to lay the groundwork of this idea of journalists as something that politicians could very publicly, very actively cast as being against the American people and being this dangerous institution that regular hardworking Americans should be fighting against. And Trump certainly picked up that ball and ran with it.
Oh my gosh. But I mean, it's really, you start to make the connections. It's really disturbing on that way. But I didn't realize the internal memos were such, I mean, I know there was vitriol, but there was a calculated effort.
Highly calculated, yeah.
Yeah, and that's what your your book really brings to light how specific and how thoughtful some of these initiatives were, with presidents trying to, control what was happening to whatever degree. But it's so important to have real journalists that are out there to serve the public, not serve themselves. I mean, Rush Limbaugh wasn't a journalist. He was a blowhard who didn't give a damn about anybody but himself and his ratings from where I sit. I've never heard anything redeeming coming out of his mouth. He was very in lockstep with what Reagan was doing. And Reagan would put on the show as, the great communicator, as if he really cared. But, the union busting was at an all-time high during his administration. It was horrible. And so, one of the points that you made in the book, you say, although sometimes sloppy, partisan, and sensationalistic, journalists have often courageously served the public when covering presidents, despite formidable forces trying to stop them. So if you read this book, you'll realize, yes, there are formidable forces. And I was just wondering, who are some of the most courageous journalists in your mind around today really doing the job? Because even, some journalists at some of the more reputable publications, like the New York Times, have had to leave and had been so-called discredited in mainstream press and had to branch out and do their own thing. I was just wondering, who do you admire in the landscape as real courageous journalists, right now?
That's a great question. And we have, role models, some of the journalists who took on Joseph McCarthy, which was incredibly courageous in the 1950s, those who challenged Wilson during World War I, and those who obviously challenged Nixon. I think I would point to, in terms of investigative reporting, David Farenfold, who until recently at the Washington Post, he's one who uncovered that the Trump's foundation actually gave very little money to charity and instead would buy huge paintings of Trump and just book events at Trump-owned resorts and was not much of a charitable institution. He's the one who uncovered the famous Access Hollywood tape where Trump is boasting about assaulting women. So in terms of investigative reporting, I'd put him at the top. Jane Mayer, I believe she's still at the New Yorker, just done incredible work about the dark money that's behind politics, the hidden money that billionaires and corporations are able to hide in terms of influencing, putting behind various candidates or trying to influence the way policies are decided. But I'd say those are two of the top investigative reporters. But I would also like to say that the amount of abuse that female journalists and journalists of color just on the whole have received in the last few years, and I'd also include Jewish journalists in there as well, are often just viciously attacked if they say or write anything that challenges the Trump narrative. And any of them who continue to do their jobs, continue to try to dig for the facts, continue to try to get information to the public, I think are doing tremendous and courageous work.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, the people that come to mind for me are Matt Taibbi, Christopher Hedges, Laura Poitras, and Glenn Greenwald with the Snowden documentary. I mean, talk about courage. That's you've got you're risking everything to get these stories, especially with Snowden, because boy, I remember Obama really coming hard at him, really wanting to get him back in this country and couldn't do it. And that's, a critical thing in terms of mass surveillance on all of us, which we didn't know unless, and you can agree or disagree with his methods or whatever, but the bottom line is covering that story, you got to have some courage, because if you don't do it right or you make a misstep, you could end up in jail or have some serious charges brought against you. And I just really admire journalists. A lot of people don't. I remember when I was on the campus. I remember when one of the young journalists that came out of Medill, I can't think of his name yet at the moment, but I'm sure you'll remind me, who was killed tragically in the Middle East when he came.
Jim Foley.
That's right.
Yeah.
And I remember when the service was happening and my class that I was teaching had just stopped, and then it just kind of hit me that this young man went and was beheaded, and it was horrible. It was just, But talk about the courage on that young man was just
Jim is
unbelievable.
A really important example of a courageous journalist who was passionate about telling stories that were being left untold. And he traveled to conflict zones. He'd been in, I believe, in either Iraq or Afghanistan. So I should know this. He definitely was in Libya during the fighting there. He'd been captured in Libya and held by the Gaddafi government for over a month. He came back, and then he went to Syria because he thought it was important to tell the stories of the civilians who were suffering incredibly through these wars, and who stories were not being told because it was dangerous to go there. But he was willing to take the risk to they say journalists should afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted. He was all about helping the afflicted. And he gave his life to do that. And it's a good reminder that it's not just Americans like Jim Foley, but journalists all over the world risk their lives today. In the Philippines, in Turkey, all around, where dictators and strongmen are ruling and don't want to ever be questioned or challenged. There's still journalists out there trying to tell those stories, and several are murdered every year, and even more are thrown in jail. Think about the people in covering the Ukraine war right now.
Exactly.
And the risks that they're taking in order that we have the information to know what's going on there. And I think most people have no idea the kind of sacrifices that are made to tell those stories.
And that's why it's so profoundly twisted and insidious how some presidents, starting with Nixon and exacerbated under the Trump administration, to cast journalists as the enemy, when actually most journalists out there are actually doing a service to us, the people. There's checks and balances in this grand experiment we have in the United States of America, with the judicial, the legislative, and the executive branches. But the fourth real check and balance is the press. And when we fall for that nonsense that the press is, it's just like, not everybody is great at doing their job.
Yeah, and people make mistakes. There's reporting that's sometimes needs to be corrected, or it's not quite, might lean one way or the other way. But I've worked with, you have too. I've worked with hundreds, if not thousands, of journalists in my career, and every single one of them, their primary motive in their job is just to try to get the facts for the story. And they may not get all the facts. They may miss some facts. They may get a few facts wrong. They may pick some facts over other facts, but they just want to put out a good story that will inform people.
Yes.
And I know there's a lot of people who think that journalists are constantly just sitting there conniving, trying to somehow distort everything. It's not the journalists I know. I know there's some very public ones, the faces we see on cable TV sometimes, who I think are less interested in the facts and more interested in trying to frame the world to conform to their opinions. But there's a whole lot of fact-based journalists out there just really trying to do a good job.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I know we need to wrap up, and I wanted to just mention, you also said something toward the end of your book. You said, declining revenues. There are declining revenues in journalism outlets, how digital outlets such as Facebook are generating revenue you mentioned from news produced and revenue not going to the organization that actually produced them. And there's something you mentioned, the Local Journalism Sustainability Act.
Yeah.
Could you just mention that a little bit, and also give us an idea of what you feel can be done, because I know we're running out of time, to give us some sort of viewpoint where, what can be done to actually enhance independent journalism.
Yeah, great chapter great question. And my last chapter is actually devoted to trying to answer it. So there's several things I mentioned there. I'll maybe highlight three of them for the purpose of time. You mentioned the Local Journalism Sustainability Act. It's a bipartisan measure. It's got both Republican and Democrats signed on as sponsors, as co-sponsors.
Wonderful.
It's been in the House. It's been in the Senate. I think at one point they were trying to fold it into the Build Back Better, Biden's big initiative, and then of course that didn't get through. But still before Congress. And what it would basically do is use tax credits to try to support local journalism, because as I'm sure you know, and many of your listeners know, local newspapers, local news outlets have been devastated in the last 10 to 20 years by the economy and by the shifts in technology. People think they can get their news. Sometimes they do get their news through their phones. Why subscribe to a local newspaper? So they've been gutted. Local Journalism Sustainability Act would give tax credits to companies who advertise in newspapers. If you advertise in a paper, you get a tax credit. If you subscribe to a newspaper or make a donation to a newspaper, and it doesn't have to be print. It could be all online news site. If you subscribe to a news outlet or give a donation to a news outlet, you get a tax credit. The news outlets, in turn, if they hire actual journalist reporters, they get some tax credit too. So they can't just be like a shell operation that's just aggregating information from somewhere else, but they actually have to hire people who are doing journalism. They get a tax credit as well.
That's terrific.
And it's a way for people in a way that people are voting. Like a lot of people in the community say, I think this news outlet is valuable. It's kind of expensive to subscribe, but hey, I'm going to get a tax credit. I think it's worth it. And I'm very wary of the government picking and choosing news outlets to give money to, but this is letting the people decide. So I hope that bill gets through Congress. We need to do something to make the tech giants, Facebook and Google, or Facebook is now Meta and Google are the biggest culprits, but Twitter and some of the others as well. Basically, they make money off the content that journalists produce, that news organizations produce. So if you or I or any of our friends on whatever social media platform we're using, I do this. I cut and paste stuff that I've read elsewhere. I post it on Facebook, or I'll put it on Twitter. Facebook sells ads, Twitter sells ads, Google search sells ads based on that content. The original news outlet doesn't necessarily get a dime of it unless people follow through to the link and then go to whatever.
Which is insane.
Right.
I mean, it's ridiculous.
So they've been using that content for free. And Meta just announced, I think it was yesterday, that they had some deal with publishers that they would pay publishers for content that was appearing on their sort of news branch. But now they're saying they're cutting that back.
Oh, geez,
so I think our tax code needs to catch up with that, and
absolutely,
and money from those tech giants who are making money off of journalism. More than half of the digital advertising dollars go to Meta and Google. More than half.
Wow.
They have such a near monopoly on it, and that advertising revenue, a lot of it's going away that would have otherwise gone to journalism. So Australia has a model of legislation that requires the social media companies to pay for journalism that they use.
Great.
So put a law behind it. I believe, say, Maryland has taxes some of the profits that the tech giants are making from journalism, and that could be fed back through things like the Sustainability Act. So I think there needs to be some legislation on the federal level to rein in what the tech giants are able to do.
Absolutely.
And then the third thing I would highlight is something which I think is responsibility of all of us, but I think also something that should be taught in the schools, which is media literacy.
Amen.
We teach algebra, we teach trigonometry.
Yes.
I'm a huge fan of poetry. I think everyone should learn poetry. I think they should also learn media literacy because we consume media almost every minute of our waking hours.
Totally.
In some way. And people should learn from an early age how the algorithms of social media work and how they channel some information to you over other information to you, depending on what you're clicking on. They should be able to distinguish propaganda from news gathering.
And even the astute observer, the learned person.
Right. It's
can
not.
give fuel.
It's hard
really
today because we're flooded with stuff.
Exactly.
I think people have a hard time understanding what is meant as opinion journalism and what is meant as we're just going to try to present the facts as best we can find them. Journalism. Not that either one of them is perfect, but people should be able to understand the difference of that. They should understand how the impact that advertising has on what content is produced.
Totally.
They should understand the conglomeration of media companies that you mentioned earlier.
It's critical.
I think that kind of understanding is essential if we're going to survive as a democracy.
Absolutely.
Should be taught in the schools, and we should, as those of us who are beyond school age, should find ways to understand it better.
Yeah, and it's just so interesting, just to wrap up, and thank you so much for that, and thank you for writing this book. The role of independent media is so critical right now because we have these news shows that have an incentive to put forth a very specific opinion, perspective. Even though Rachel Maddow or Chris Hayes can do some real journalism, but the way they present it is oftentimes a rebuttal to what Fox is doing, so they're actually reacting to what Fox is doing, and then we get all of these reports that are just ginning people up, and there's not a whole lot of real communication.
It's ginned up controversy, right? Yeah, and controversy sells for cable news, at least.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so when you have independent media outlets that are not run by that, all of a sudden you have the possibility of an informed citizenry that actually might be productive moving forward. So I learned so much from your book. Again, for those of you who want to check this out, it's called Clash, Presidents and the Press in Times of Crisis, written by my dear friend and colleague Jon Marshall. I encourage you all to get it. Are there any parting shots for our viewers that we should take away from this conversation, or anything that you want to let us in on that we should know as to motivate us to read the book and get clear on what's happening?
Oh gosh, I could probably talk for hours, and Steve, I really greatly appreciate the opportunity to be on your show, and it's always good to talk with you. I'll just try to end with something fun.
Okay.
Not in the book, but after researching these presidents, it's almost felt like I was living with them as I wrote each chapter. I was just so immersed in what they did, and kind of in my head, I imagined I was going to have a barbecue, and which presidents would I want to have at my barbecue?
That's a good one.
The one I decided I would least want to have would be Woodrow Wilson. First, he's a raging racist, so that pretty much knocks him out to begin with. Even if you could set that aside, he was such a sort of stern. He just felt he was just sure he knew the truth about everything, and would just lecture people and be very stern. It just did not seem like a whole lot of fun to hang out with.
Right.
The one I would want to invite to my cocktail barbecue would be Franklin Roosevelt, because he was known for really being able to mix a good cocktail, as well as being highly sociable. So I figured he'd be a lot of fun to have there and would help get the party going. So if you want party advice on presidents, read Clash, Presidents in the Press in Times of Crisis.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, John. It's been a real pleasure.
You're welcome, Steve. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you for tuning into the show. If you enjoy this podcast, make sure to subscribe to hear more compelling shows on Rhythm of Life and keep an eye out for our upcoming series of how we as a society oftentimes incentivize all the wrong behavior here in the United States. We see this in the healthcare industry, in the media, and in our educational systems, to name a few of the fields we will be covering. If you have a moment, please leave a rating and review so more people can hear about us, and share about Rhythm of Life on social media, and like us on Facebook. Thanks for listening. I'm Steve Ordower.
This has been a Rhythm and Light production.